Thank you so much for inviting me to speak about a very topical topic, if you forgive the play of words, smart cities, because it is definitely one of the areas where Russia has a really great potential due to its, its incredibly educated workforce that enables it to adopt new technologies quite quickly. A couple of words about my firm. We have been helping Western investors invest into Russia since 1992. We are the world's largest risk consulting firm. What we generally do for foreign investors are two types of services. We help them screen their potential business partners through our reputational due diligence reports. We help them screen potential suppliers through our background checks, or we help them deal with internal issues through our internal fraud investigations. We are an American firm headquartered in London. I'm an Italian who was, by chance, born in the Soviet Union, so we're rather international. And it's quite interesting to be running a small boutique consulting firm in Moscow today, which is of American origin. Because actually, I would like to second what Mr. Rodzianko just told us, the business-to-business contacts are very, very good. I don't sound American, I'm not American, maybe it's easier for me, but the fact that we are American is not being held against us, and our clients still come to us. And I would say about 70% of our client base is now Russian as opposed to foreign. I'm a little bit less optimistic about foreign direct investment into this country. We're a bit of a weather vane of foreign direct investment. Typically, people who invest into this country come to us and a few other firms in the sector to receive due diligences. There's not that much going on, despite the fact that the US remains on the top of the FDI list into this country. A lot of that is investment from existing situations by companies who are already here. By the way, my native Italy is number 5, which is amazing, given the small size of our country. And just to explain why this is the case, it is the psychological effect of sanctions rather than actual sanctions. Even if you take into account the latest round of sanctions end of April, which did include certain pure play businessmen, not particularly linked to the Kremlin, unless you're part of the American administration, then you think they are. But fundamentally, the reluctance of the American board to incur Russia risk today is very, very high. Because the real question is not, are you sanctioned? I mean, discovering whether Mr. Russo is sanctioned or not takes 30 seconds it's a yes or no answer in a database. The real question is Mr. Russo, who's a big Russian businessman, could he be sanctioned in the future? And this is the real question that nobody has an answer to, unless you are a super insider in the US State Department. So Kroll has over 30 offices in the world. We cover all emerging markets. We've been here since 1996. And fundamentally, Russia is a very, very interesting market for us. Moving on to smart cities, from our point of view, smart cities are interesting because it involves new technology. I mean, I've promised my friends at Leonardo to plug Selex, who is an Italian systems provider who do a lot of good work here in Russia on utilities and also on security technology. So while there's new technologies and new approaches to things that together form what we call smart cities, there's still problems that generally fall under the term Russia risk. And Russia risk does not change if you're talking about smart cities or we're talking about non-smart technologies. The key risk that we deal with is corruption. We produce a report where we ask businessmen all over the world, how was it for you last year? It's called the Global Kroll Annual Global Fraud and Risk Survey. And we asked them, how was it for you? And 89% of Russian respondents, these are both Russian executives and Russian executives, these are executives in both Russian and foreign firms operating in Russia. 89% of them say that there was a fraud incident in 2017, and that's an increase on the year before. We've been doing this for about 10 years, and we see a steep rise. Now, that's a problem here that exists in smart cities and it exists in other factors as well. But to that, I would say, how do you feel about doing an investment in southern Italy? As in, this corruption issue is an emerging market or emerged market issue, and I'm getting bad looks from my colleague Dr. Russo, but rather than a Russia-specific issue. So we should not believe the New York Times too much when they write about Russia as this incredibly dangerous place with this wholly corrupt. There are certain trends here that we see in all other emerging markets that we operate. Other issues that we see that affect smart cities is what Mr. Rodzianko explained. Now, he obviously runs a very important umbrella organization, and he sees you have a very good helicopter view on all the problems around registration. It took me and my team yesterday 7 hours to register me. That's, if I give you my hourly rate, and my colleague from BCG can imagine what the hourly rate is, that's money lost in taxation to the Russian government because I've spent 7 hours trying to register myself yesterday. I think we figured it out, except I have friends whose landlords live in Italy. If you have a nice flat in Moscow, frankly, and you're not me or Mr. Rodzianko, you will live on the French Riviera. If you own a flat in Moscow, you got to fly back to register people. What's the relevance to smart cities? There's no point talking up this idea of smart cities, which exists, but then you face regulation of this kind that make it really, really difficult for people to operate in. To conclude this pre-prepared part of my talk, forgive me, I was informed I had to speak for 10 minutes, so trying to find things to say for half an hour will be quite interesting. I wanted to give you 2 case studies of work that my firm did in the last 6 months in the smart city space to see how a firm such as ours can help and what kind of things can go wrong. Obviously, the case studies are real, but the names of the actors have been anonymized for obvious reasons. We look at tech startups a lot. I mean, because essentially, this amazing mathematics education that you get in this country. I mean, it's mathematics and music, but music is irrelevant to our topic right now. But this amazing mathematics education that Russians get means that there's a lot of tech startups. And it's really one of the positive legacies of the Soviet Union, because you have tech startups in Minsk and in Kiev as well, but obviously the scale of the Russian innovation is much higher. And we get asked to look at these entrepreneurs who come really from nowhere, on the back of their brilliance and their mind and their ideas, develop a business that at some point becomes worth investing in. Now, sometimes the situation is funny. Sometimes we get asked to look at the Russian guy who emigrated to the US when he was 9, and he went to Stanford undergrad, and some MBA as well, and then they want a report from us. And we then turn this job down, because clearly somebody who left the Soviet Union when they were 9 doesn't have a Russian footprint. That would be a waste of client budgets. But at times, there's genuine Russian startups that are worth looking into. And the types of things that we look at are pretty much similar to issues that we look in the old economy. So beneficial ownership, who really owns the company we're looking at? How did this guy make his first million? What kind of political connections are there? What kind of interface with the government did this guy have? How valuable is the technology once you strip out political and other connections? And really the key question is, whose money is it? And in the smart city space, the answers to these questions are better than in the old economy. And that's why we're very optimistic about smart cities here. Because in the old economy, you get situations like, oh, not quite clear what happened in the 90s. At some point had $10 million, was then involved in some corporate raid, then got to privatize a state-owned asset quite cheaply, and since 2000, the guy is quite clean. So this would be a typical story about a Russian oligarch, let's say, that made money in the old economy in the 90s. That's a complicated story to sell to a Western investor. A much better story, which we see in smart cities, is finished a really good Russian university, had an idea, got together with a buddy from university in the back of his mother's dacha, a living room, started with one Apple computer, and now has this great software that helps energy utilities count their money better. Now that's a much better story for a foreign investor, and there's no involvement in privatization of the 90s, there's no involvement with the government, and there are really no issues. And also, the other great thing is that smart cities are a new thing, which means any wealth accumulated in the smart city space has been accumulated recently. That's great, because actually, you can remember, you can find your bank account information for the last 3 years. People know what you did for the last 3 years. Remembering what somebody did in 1993, you know, which market in Moscow the guy operated a stall in, is much, much harder. So smart cities are actually a really nice space to do my work, because the reports tend to be really positive. And clearly, in smart cities, the word UPG, or organized crime group, doesn't even come into play. It's not, so far, maybe I'm being optimistic, is not an issue. And so this is something where I'm very positive about. I'll give you 2 examples before we open up to the floor or to the next speaker. We were asked to look at a Russian startup founder, and the kid was great, studies here, postgrad in America. The startup made a lot of sense, but had started with a quite significant starting capital, and the guy was only 25. So the real question is, you know, how does a 25-year-old guy with a good idea drive 3 Bentleys? So that was kind of the question. And where did this origins of wealth come into play? And really, why is it that he was doing business with all the big state-owned Russian banks? How did this guy get his first break? Was there something funny there? And the answer was, no, there wasn't anything funny. His father happens to be a very senior Russian banker who had introduced his son to people, but everything was by the book. The books of the company made sense. The idea was good, and the investment at the end actually took place, but as far as I remember, the father was somehow factored in by the client, and it was clear that this was a family business rather than the business belonging to a 25-year-old. Another example of a smart city story is again a reputational due diligence into and here I need to be careful because the guy is fairly famous. Let's call him a Russian IT entrepreneur. Russian IT entrepreneur who had gotten into trouble with a specific part of the Russian government for a specific reason. And the question was, how solid is the technology? How good is his reputation? And why is this conflict actually taking place? We were able to contextualize that conflict to something quite specific. We were able to show that the technology was sound, the company was sound, the guy was okay, and actually had a good reputation in the local market among Russian business circles, and actually with other parts of the Russian government not involved in that specific conflict. And again, this investment went ahead. So these are the kinds of issues that we face with smart cities. Clearly, there's another part, and just to conclude, there's another part of my business that deals with security and engineering, security technology, and there's an aspect to smart cities that I'm not going to talk about, but we should keep in mind that smart cities are not only utilities or waste management or citizen service, but it's also closed-circuit televisions and smart facial recognition, which is obviously used, as we know, on Tverskaya, every face is being recognized. And this is another aspect that's probably worth discussing, but it's not really what I do myself for a living. Thank you.